Only I was there for my husband's funeral. Neither our son nor our daughter attended, not even a single grandchild. It was just me standing beside his coffin as the biting wind howled through the chapel courtyard, a wind so fierce it seemed even the weather couldn't bear to linger. The funeral director seemed ill at ease, his eyes darting nervously between the rows of empty seats and my own face. He cleared his throat, once, then again, as if searching for the right words. "Would you like us to wait a few more minutes, Mrs. Holloway?" "No," I said, resolute. "Start." George would have hated a delay. He was a man of impeccable timing, punctual until his very last days. He took his medication religiously, watched the evening news promptly at 6, and meticulously placed his slippers side by side before retiring to bed. A creature of habit, a man of inherent dignity, and now, a man being laid to rest all alone. I sat in the front row, surrounded by 5 vacant chairs. The pastor recited scripture mechanically, his voice devoid of genuine feeling. The flowers seemed garishly bright, the casket excessively polished. I couldn't help but imagine George's reaction, a hearty laugh at all the pomp and circumstance, followed by a bewildered glance around, demanding to know where the hell the kids were. Where were they indeed? A terse message had arrived that morning, a one-liner from our son, Peter.
"Sorry, Mom.
Something came up.
Can't make it."
No explanation. No phone call. I pictured him at his office, or more likely, on a golf course schmoozing with clients, pretending not to feel the weight of the day, treating his father's death as a mere blip on his busy calendar. Our daughter, Celia, hadn't bothered to message at all. She'd left a breezy voicemail 2 days prior, light as a spring breeze. "Mom, I really can't cancel my nail appointment, and you know how anxious I get with reschedules. Tell Dad I'll visit him next week." Next week? As if the dead have time to wait. Just remember who you are, and remember what love looks like when it's real. His eyes were wet now. He wiped them with his sleeve, just as he used to do when he was a little boy, and didn't want anyone to see him crying. We sat there for a long time, not speaking, simply being, in each other's presence. Just as George and I used to sit in the evenings, 2 people who didn't need to fill the air with empty words in order to feel profoundly close. As he was leaving, Ethan turned to me at the door, a hopeful look on his face. "If I come over next weekend, could we make pancakes again?" I smiled, a genuine, heartfelt smile spreading across my face for the first time in days. "We'll even use the good syrup," I replied. Celia showed up the next morning. I knew she would, not because she missed me, not because she needed comfort, but because I had stopped responding to her text messages. She arrived without warning, the tires of her black SUV crunching on the gravel driveway too fast, as if she were late for something far more important. She didn't knock, just walked right in, the way she always used to, as if the house still somehow belonged to her. "Mom," she said, dropping her oversized handbag heavily on the hall table. "I've been trying to reach you."
I didn't get up from my chair.
I was folding laundry slowly, deliberately, matching socks as if it were the most crucial task in the entire world. "I've been busy," I said, my voice neutral. She scoffed softly, her expression dismissive. "Busy with what?" I didn't answer, continuing with my task. She walked into the kitchen, poured herself a glass of water without asking, and leaned against the counter, as if she owned the walls. "So," she said, her voice sharp. "Is it true?" I looked up at her, my movements deliberate. "What exactly are you referring to, Celia?" She tapped her perfectly manicured nails impatiently against the glass. "Ethan said you're changing your will. That night, I made dinner just for myself. Not quick food, not leftovers, but a complete, satisfying meal. I set the table properly, used the good dishes, and lit a candle. I played the radio softly in the background, the same station George liked, even if they talked more than they played music now, and I ate in silence. Not lonely silence, but contented aloneness. There's a definite difference. Afterward, I walked into the den and looked around. The room had always been George's space, filled with papers, books, and half-finished crossword puzzles. I hadn't touched much since he passed, but tonight I did. I dusted, opened the windows, and aired it out. Then I sat at his desk and wrote a letter to myself. Just a few simple lines. Asterisk, you are not invisible. You are not a burden. You are not required to earn peace through exhaustion. I folded the paper and tucked it into the drawer beside his last crossword puzzle, still unfinished. The answer to 14 down remained blank. The clue was, end of one chapter, start of another.
I didn't need to know the answer.
I was already living it. The envelope was addressed in his familiar handwriting. I recognized it instantly, slightly tilted, careful block letters with uneven spacing. Ethan had always pressed too hard with his pen, as if the words wouldn't count unless they left a dent in the paper. It arrived 3 days after our conversation, tucked between a credit card offer and a grocery flyer. I brought it inside, set it on the kitchen counter, and stared at it while the kettle boiled. I didn't open it right away. I let it sit there, the way I used to let my birthday card sit unopened on the mantel until after dinner, prolonging the sense of anticipation. When the tea was ready, I sat down and opened the envelope. Dear Grandma. Asterisk, I wanted to write this instead of just sending a text. I know I could have just said it last time I saw you, but I was still trying to find the right words. After the service, I walked alone behind the pallbearers, my steps measured and somber. I didn't shed a single tear, not because I wasn't grieving. I had been grieving for months, but because there exists a sorrow so profound it settles deep inside, unmoving as an anchor. And on that day, I felt utterly buried beneath its weight. The cemetery was almost deserted. An old groundskeeper watched from afar, his hand resting on a spade. The coffin was lowered, the prayers whispered. Dust returned to wood, wood to silence. I lingered for a while after the others had left. My heels sank slightly into the soft earth, and I felt the wind tug at my coat. The headstone would be placed later. For now, a simple plaque bore George's name. George Holloway, beloved husband, father, forgotten. The word echoed in my mind, grating like a stone in my shoe. Forgotten. Back at home, the quiet was deafening. His recliner sat untouched, his slippers neatly aligned, the TV remote exactly where he'd last left it. I stared at it for what felt like an eternity. Then, I walked to the kitchen, retrieved a bottle of wine, a fine one from the cabinet I usually reserved for guests, and poured myself a glass. I pulled out my phone and opened Instagram. I rarely used it, but something compelled me to look. Celia's profile was, of course, public. She had posted 2 hours earlier, a picture of her and 3 girlfriends, drinks in hand, radiating a superficial joy. Caption: Girls' Brunch. Bottomless mimosas. Living our best lives. Peter had posted too. A snapshot of the 9th hole, his new driver glinting in the sun. Killer swing. Perfect weather. Deals made. I stared at the screen until the images blurred, then switched off the phone, took another sip of wine, and fixed my gaze on the photo on the wall. George and I on our 40th anniversary, standing proudly beside the rose bushes he'd planted with his own hands. They used to bloom a vibrant red. Now they stood bare and lifeless. I finished folding a shirt and placed it neatly in the basket, taking my time. I am excluding both Peter and yourself, yes. Celia laughed, a short, bitter sound devoid of genuine humor. Are you serious? After everything we've done for you, after everything you've done? I looked up at her now, the folding complete, my hands still. You didn't come to your father's funeral, Celia. You didn't send flowers. You didn't call. You didn't even ask. I had an appointment, she interjected defensively, her voice rising. Yes, I cut her off, my tone unwavering. Your nails, and then brunch. I saw the photos. She blinked, but didn't deny it. You want to talk about what you've done for me? I continued, my voice gathering force. You sent me grocery lists, bills, school payments, mortgage requests, and I paid them quietly, without ever asking for anything in return. That's what family does, she snapped, her eyes flashing with anger. We help each other. No, I said softly, the word hanging in the air. That's what mothers do, and I did it for years. She fell silent, the fight momentarily draining out of her. Your father built this home with his own bare hands, I continued, my voice softening. He didn't have much, but he had his pride. He taught you that respect is measured in actions, not empty words. And you couldn't give him 2 hours for a final goodbye. That's not fair, is it? She stared at the floor, avoiding my gaze. So, you're really cutting us out? Just like that? No, I said, my voice resonating with a quiet strength.
Not just like that.
I spent the last 20 years giving without ever receiving. I buried my husband completely alone. I sat beside his grave and waited for my children. They never came. That's not just like that, Celia. That's a lifetime. She folded her arms, trying to appear composed, but her mouth was drawn tight, betraying her true emotions. You're punishing us, she accused, her voice laced with resentment. And now, after thinking about it for a few days, I don't think there are perfect words. So here are the honest ones. Asterisk, thank you. Not just for the trust or the house or the cabin, though I know what a big thing that is, but for something else, for being the one person in this family who never asked me to be anything but exactly who I am. You've always made space for me, even when my parents were pushing me to be more polished, more ambitious, more, I don't know, strategic. You were never strategic. You were just real. Asterisk, I didn't know Grandpa was sick. I didn't know he died. I still don't really know how to process that. And I'm so sorry. I would have been there.
You know I would have been.
And I'm so angry at Mom for not telling me, for assuming it didn't matter. Asterisk, I don't know what made you choose me, but I promise I won't waste it. I'm not going to let you down. I want to take care of this house, Grandma. I want to learn about what you and Grandpa built. I want to understand the kind of strength it takes to keep showing up when no one else does. Asterisk, I love you. I don't say that enough, but I do. I always have. I read it 3 times, once with my eyes dry, once with my hand pressed against my chest, and once with tears sliding silently down my jaw. Then I set the letter on the mantel and stood in front of it, as if it were something sacred. Because in this house, letters like that were rare. Not because love didn't exist, but because it had gone unspoken for too long, assumed, and stretched too thin. I didn't need the money I'd set aside, not anymore. But I needed this. I needed to know that something I'd done, some small, quiet investment of time and tenderness, had not been swallowed whole by ungrateful children and performative holiday gatherings. That night, I sat in George's chair and watched the shadows lengthen and shift across the floor as the sun dipped behind the maple trees. Tomorrow, I thought, I'll call the lawyer. I'll make changes quietly, with the same dignity George lived by. Because if I was the only one to show up for his final goodbye, I would be the only one to carry out his final will, their final judgment. That evening, I sat alone in our kitchen, the very room where George used to peel apples with surgical precision, transforming them into neat, crescent-shaped slices and arranging them artfully on a plate. He'd always offer me the best piece, the one with the most sunshine, as he called it. Now, the fruit bowl sat untouched, a couple of overripe pears sagging under their own weight. The silence wasn't unfamiliar. George had been gone for nearly 2 weeks before the funeral, and those days had already begun to teach me the shape of solitude. But tonight, it pressed harder, louder, crueler. I couldn't shake the image of the empty chairs or Celia's flippant message, or rather, the hollowness of it. I had raised a daughter who could watch her father be lowered into the earth from the carefree comfort of a brunch table. Had I failed her, or had she failed something deep within herself, something that could no longer be salvaged? Peter's text message lingered in my mind. No punctuation, no warmth, just a flat, cold rejection in black and white. Something came up. Was it shame, indifference, or the kind of casual cruelty one doesn't even recognize until it's far too late? I poured another glass of wine, not out of despair, but out of a newfound clarity. I walked down the hallway to our bedroom and opened the top drawer of George's desk. His things were still organized with meticulous care. Envelopes, spare keys, an old stamp book. I reached behind the files and pulled out the folder I kept hidden behind everything else. Thin, neat, secured with a rubber band. It was labeled estate. No, Celia, I said, my voice steady. I'm freeing myself and giving everything to Ethan. I said nothing further, allowing my words to hang in the heavy silence between us. She laughed again, this time the sound brittle and high-pitched. He's just a kid. What does he know about responsibility? He knows how to show up, I replied, my voice unwavering. The silence that followed was palpable, thick with unspoken resentments and regrets. I thought she might cry. I thought she might start shouting. Instead, she picked up her bag, the silence amplifying the click of the clasp. Well, she said, adjusting her designer sunglasses, her voice carefully controlled. I hope this makes you feel powerful. No, I said calmly, my gaze unwavering. It makes me feel peaceful. She left without another word, her departure marked by the sharp slam of the door. I waited until I heard the car pull away before I picked up the trust papers from the dining table and carefully set them beside the folded laundry, my hands steady. Later that evening, I found a letter lying on the doorstep. No stamp, no envelope, just a sheet of paper creased and smudged, its edges worn. You don't understand what it's like to balance everything. We tried our best. Maybe we failed, but cutting us out. Like this wasn't the answer I was looking for. After reading it twice, I simply folded it in half and relegated it to the miscellaneous drawer, because that's all it had become, just another useless piece of paper. Too little, too late to make any difference. Peter arrived the following day. Unlike Celia, he didn't barge in unannounced. He knocked gently twice, paused, and then knocked again. I opened the door slowly, already anticipating that he wouldn't be alone, and I was right. Standing behind him was Meredith, his wife, wearing her perpetual, forced smile and a scarf that was far too extravagant for the mild weather. Ethan was the kind of man George would have respected, not loud, not pushy, but steady, curious, and present. That last quality mattered more than anything now, being present, not just showing up, but truly seeing. I knew he wouldn't waste the trust, not because of the money itself, but because he'd tasted what it meant to be forgotten and overlooked. And people like that don't let things rot in silence. He'd plant something with it. He'd remember. I closed my eyes and listened to the soft creaks of the house as the temperature dropped. Wood shifting, settling, breathing. It was a sound I'd once found lonely. Now, it sounded like life continuing, like legacy whispering back. Evenings had a new rhythm now. No more phone calls from Celia asking if I could just stop by the school to pick up Ethan, not because she needed me, but because her yoga class ran late. No more messages from Peter wondering if I'd mind covering a surprise car repair, never quite urgent enough to justify real panic, but always just enough to apply pressure. The silence had become a gentle balm. That evening, I set the table for one, not because I was lonely, but because I finally understood the profound difference between simply eating and being truly fed. I made roast chicken, rewrote roast chicken, not frozen or microwaved. Potatoes, too. I used rosemary from the garden George had planted back when we still believed weekends were meant for laughter instead of endless errands. I lit a candle. I didn't need it, but I wanted it. Halfway through dinner, the house was so quiet I could hear the faint ticking of the clock in the hallway. I remember that clock from the first apartment George and I ever rented. How loud it had sounded when we lay awake at night, with no money, no insurance, and no real plan except each other. He always said, "We'll build something, even if it's slow." It was slow, and it was beautiful. Inside were copies of our will, a list of beneficiaries, our explicit instructions for what should happen to the house, the car, the accounts, even the antique clock George's grandfather had brought over from Dublin. Everything had been carefully prepared and reviewed by our lawyer 2 years ago, with both love and foresight. I sat on the edge of the bed and opened the file. Peter was listed as co-beneficiary of the main investment account, the one that held nearly $300,000 accumulated over a lifetime of hard work and frugal living. He and Celia were both included in the house transfer clause. Even the lake cabin, the one they never visited anymore but always inquired about when taxes were due, was earmarked for them. I held the pages in my hand, my fingers trembling, not from age, but from something far deeper. Betrayal has a pulse, and mine was throbbing fiercely in my ears. I rose and walked to the closet, pulling out a canvas storage bin. Inside were all the old photos. Family reunions, birthdays, holidays. George holding the children when they were small. Me on the porch, laughing. Celia tugging at my sleeve. Peter asleep in George's lap, a book fallen open across his chest. We were once a family, a unit of unwavering love and support. Perhaps I had been too naive to see how far that family had drifted. Maybe love doesn't erode in a raging storm. Perhaps it simply fades, like wallpaper exposed to constant sun, quietly losing its vibrancy until one day you can no longer recognize the original pattern. I picked up a photo of George and Peter fishing. Peter must have been around 12. George had his arm around him, pointing at something in the water, his smile genuine and full of warmth. That man deserved more than an empty chapel. I put the photo down. Then I picked up the phone. It was nearly midnight, but I didn't care. I called Thomas Fields, our lawyer. It went to voicemail as expected. I left a message anyway. Thomas, it's May Holloway. She gave me a curt nod. As if I were a mere acquaintance, she'd reluctantly agreed to meet. Mom, Peter began, his voice unnaturally calm, as if he'd rehearsed the lines countless times. Can we come in? I stepped aside, allowing them entry. He scanned the house with a detached gaze, like a visitor touring a museum exhibit of a life he no longer recognized or felt connected to. I'll lead you to the sitting room. They didn't even bother to remove their coats. I heard from Celia, he started, and from Ethan. I imagine you did too. He cleared his throat, a nervous tick. It seems there's been some confusion. I remained silent, offering no encouragement. Meredith delicately crossed her legs, the large diamonds on her finger catching the afternoon sunlight, almost blindingly. We understand this is a difficult time for you, May. Emotions tend to run high after a loss. I fixed her with a cold stare. You didn't attend his funeral either, did you? She blinked, momentarily thrown off balance. I had a client dinner. A very important international deal. Peter shifted uncomfortably. Mom, please listen. I should have called. I should have come, but honestly, I didn't know how. I thought maybe. No, I interrupted, cutting him off. You thought maybe if you ignored it long enough, the grief would somehow become someone else's burden. He averted his eyes, unable to meet my gaze. I waited. I continued, pressing on. I sat alone in a room built with your father's own 2 hands while they lowered him into the cold earth. And not a single one of you bothered to show up. Peter started to speak, but Meredith quickly placed a restraining hand on his knee, a silent signal for him to be quiet and let her handle things. We understand you're upset, she said, her voice carefully modulated. And, of course, it's your right to change a will if you wish. But let's be reasonable here. Ethan is just a child. He's only 19. Yes, but he's still inexperienced, she countered smoothly. After dinner, I washed the dishes slowly, not rushed, not multitasking, not even thinking about whether someone else would need the kitchen next. I dried them, put them away, and then I did something I hadn't done in decades. I danced, not well, not for long, but enough. I turned on the record player, the old one George had tried to fix 100 times until he finally gave up and said it had more charm with a scratch. He was right. It skipped every third line, and I still knew all the lyrics. I danced in the living room barefoot, my arms raised slightly, my body stiff in places I didn't even remember being stiff. My knees reminded me that I was 79. But my heart, my heart was 20 again. I danced like nobody was watching because, for once, nobody was, not to judge, not to expect, not to wait until I stopped so they could hand me a bill or a need or a favor. Just me, in the house I kept, in the quiet I had earned. I paused only when I noticed the fireplace, and used cold, with a layer of ash still remaining from the last winter George was alive. I knelt and cleaned it out carefully, sweeping the old ashes away. It felt like a ritual, like something sacred. I found a small note tucked into a basket of kindling I hadn't touched in years. It was in George's handwriting, short and simple. Asterisk, keep dancing, even if it's just in the kitchen. The world will try to make you forget who you are. Don't let it. I sat back on my heels, hands covered in dust, tears welling but not spilling. He had known, maybe not exactly how things would play out, but he had known what life would try to do to me, how it would try to make me smaller, more polite, more accommodating. And he had left this message like a trail marker in the woods. I sat there on the rug for a while, gazing at the empty hearth. Not empty, I corrected myself. Waiting. I need to revise my will urgently. Call me in the morning. I ended the call and stood for a long moment by the window. The moonlight illuminated the tops of the rose bushes outside. They had withered since George's passing, not from neglect, but almost as if in shared grief. I knew I should prune them, give them room to bloom again. But not tonight. Tonight, I would simply let the old petals fall. Tomorrow, I would begin cutting out what no longer belonged. The lawyer's office smelled of old books and eucalyptus polish, the kind of place where time felt dense and silence held a particular weight. Thomas Fields had known George and me for over 30 years. He had handled our first mortgage, George's business license, the deed to the lake house, and eventually our estate plan, a trustworthy, precise man who, like me, was a little weary of people who smiled only when they wanted something. He looked up from his desk as I entered, rising from his chair with a hint of surprise on his face. "May," he said, buttoning his jacket. "You're here early." "It couldn't wait," I answered, settling into the leather chair opposite him. The scent of the garden clung faintly to my coat. I'd pruned the dead roses that morning, early before breakfast. Pruning always grounded me. There was something profoundly honest about cutting back what no longer served. "I got your message," Thomas said, resuming his seat. "You said you want to revise your will?" "Yes," I said, my voice firm. "Peter and Celia are to be removed entirely." He paused, not out of shock, but out of genuine concern. "Are you sure about this, May?" I looked him directly in the eye, my gaze unwavering. "I buried my husband alone. Our children didn't come. Not a call, not a flower. They were too busy." I placed my hands calmly on the table. "They don't deserve a dime." Thomas gave a slow nod, his expression thoughtful. "Then we'll draft a full amendment. You want to remove them from every provision?"
Yes.
"He doesn't have the knowledge to handle a trust or manage a property. He could be easily manipulated." I raised a skeptical eyebrow. "Manipulated by whom, exactly?" Meredith didn't flinch. "By people who know he's inherited something of value," she implied, "like you, perhaps." The thought hung unspoken in the air. Peter tried again, desperation creeping into his voice. "Mom, I know I've disappointed you. I know I haven't always been the best son, but you have to admit this is a bit extreme, isn't it?" "No," I said softly but firmly. "What's extreme is abandoning your own father. What's extreme is living your lives as if the people who raised you are somehow disposable." He swallowed hard, the reality of the situation sinking in.
"So that's it then."
"You're just cutting us off completely." "You cut yourselves off long ago," I replied, my voice unwavering. "I'm simply acknowledging the fact." Meredith stood abruptly, her composure cracking slightly. "This could get very complicated, May. Legally speaking." I met her gaze, unflinching. "It won't. The paperwork is clean and airtight. My lawyer is excellent, and I've had plenty of time to think this through." Peter looked older than I remembered, his temples thinning, his eyes shadowed with a hollow weariness. "I thought you believed in forgiving people." "I do," I said. "But forgiveness doesn't automatically grant you access back into my life." They didn't argue further. They rose stiffly, thanked me with forced politeness, and then left. It was only after the door clicked shut behind them that I felt the tremor in my hands, a subtle shaking. Not from fear, not from doubt, but from a deep sense of release. I sat by the window for a long time, watching the last traces of light fade from the sky. The roses in the garden were almost bare now, their petals gone. Winter was drawing near. George would have said, "They'll bloom again," and he would have been right. But those blooms wouldn't be for everyone. Later that night, I opened my bedroom window just an inch, letting the autumn air sweep in, the kind that smells like dying leaves and something clean and fresh underneath. I lay under the quilt I'd made back in '84 when George was still working long hours and the kids were in school, and I still thought exhaustion was a kind of virtue. Now I know better. Now I know peace is a far better measure. My body was tired, but not in the old way, not the way it used to be when the weight of other people's needs settled into my spine like a second skeleton. This was a good tired, an earned tired, the kind that comes after claiming something back. Not a throne, not revenge, just a name.
Mine.
I didn't expect her. When I opened the door and saw Meredith standing there, alone, with no car in sight and no Peter trailing behind with an apology rehearsed in a mirror, I felt a strange, quiet settle over me. She was holding a pie, a store-bought apple pie. I raised an eyebrow. She offered a nervous smile. It's apple. I stepped aside, not out of kindness or obligation, but simply out of curiosity. She walked in like someone who had been inside before, but had never really looked around. Her eyes grazed the hallway, the pictures, the coat rack George built in 1981, the same one Peter had broken a peg off as a child and then lied about. George never fixed it, said it was part of the story now. Meredith stood awkwardly in the kitchen. I didn't offer her tea, and I didn't tell her to sit. I let the silence do its work. Finally, she said, I didn't come to ask for anything. Good. I heard what happened, what you told Peter about the trust, the house, everything. I nodded, acknowledging her words. I know you probably don't believe me, she continued, her hands now clasped tightly in front of her. But I wanted to say thank you.
That startled me.
Thank you for what, exactly? For not giving it to Peter. The accounts, the house, the cabin, everything. Understood. He opened a legal pad and began to write in neat, precise lines. Do you want to redirect the assets to someone else? I thought of Ethan, my grandson, Celia's son, the only one who ever visited without expecting anything in return. The boy who mowed my lawn in July, not because he was asked, but because he felt I shouldn't be out there sweating in the heat. Who brought me library books and genuinely sought my opinion on them. Who had once said, Grandma, I like talking to you more than kids my age. I took a deep breath, my heart swelling with affection. Yes, I said. I'd like to set up a trust for Ethan. I want him to have the house, the cabin, and the remainder of the estate. I want it structured carefully, protected from his parents' reach. That can be arranged, Thomas said, with the kind of dry professionalism I appreciated. We'll create an irrevocable trust in Ethan's name. He won't have full access until he's 30, unless for education or medical expenses. Does that sound acceptable? It sounds perfect, I replied, a sense of rightness settling over me. We spent the next hour meticulously reviewing details, page after page, clause after clause. I didn't flinch, not once. When you've buried your husband with your own hands and stood beside an open grave without a single child in sight, a stack of legal documents holds no fear. Nothing trivial can touch you after that. As we neared the end, Thomas looked up from his desk again, his gaze thoughtful. May, I must say, this isn't something many people your age do so decisively. Most want to forgive, to keep the peace. I've kept the peace for 80 years, I said quietly, my voice resonating with conviction. And it buried me long before it buried George. He didn't ask any more questions, understanding the depth of my resolve. By the time I left the office, the sun was just beginning to cast long shadows across the sidewalk. The bank smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and quiet, understated power, the kind of place where old money moved with glacial slowness and nobody ever raised their voice. I hadn't been inside in almost a year, but they remembered me. Mrs. Holloway, the receptionist, greeted me, standing immediately. Mr. Jansen will be right with you. I nodded politely and waited by the tall windows that overlooked Main Street. Outside, people hurried about their daily errands, heads down, lost in their own busy worlds. Inside, the atmosphere was still and expectant, as if something of great importance was always just on the verge of happening. Mr. Jansen, Richard, emerged a minute later, as impeccably dressed and sharp as ever in his tailored suit. He looked like someone who had never spilled a drop of coffee on himself in his entire life. May, he greeted me warmly, shaking my hand with genuine pleasure. I was rather surprised by your message. Good, I said. Surprise is a healthy thing. He smiled, slightly unsure of my meaning, and led me into his office. Glass walls, a massive walnut desk, and a single framed photo of his dog. George would have appreciated that, one honest face in a room full of finance. I understand you want to make some changes, he said, opening my account file. I already made them, I replied. I'm here to ensure they're carried out without any further delay. He scanned the notes, his eyebrows arching higher with each line he read. You've revoked all linked transfers, removed Peter and Celia as beneficiaries, and established an irrevocable trust in Ethan's name. That's a very significant shift. I'm a significant woman, I said, my tone leaving no room for argument. He chuckled, a genuine sound of amusement. Yes, you are indeed. I leaned forward slightly, fixing him with a direct gaze. I want safeguards, Richard. She looked up, and for the first time in all the years I'd known her, I saw something genuine in her eyes, something not filtered or calculated. Peter never learned how to stand on his own. She said he grew up with everything handled for him. I try to keep up that illusion, but... She stopped, her eyes becoming glassy. You enabling it didn't help, but neither did I. And now it's just who he is. I said nothing, allowing her to continue. She went on, I know he blames you and Celia blames you, but what they don't. What I'm saying is, you are the one holding everything together while all they did was complain about how you did it. I leaned against the counter, arms folded across my chest. So, why the sudden confession now? Because I'm exhausted too, she whispered, her voice barely audible. We stood in the stillness of the kitchen for what felt like an eternity. No one stirred. The untouched pie sat between us, a silent observer. Finally, she lowered herself into a chair. I want you to know I admired George, she began. He showed me kindness, even when he had no reason to. And I realize I never properly thanked you for everything you did, the help, the money, the babysitting, just your constant presence. I watched her, saying nothing. You didn't owe me any of that. Thanks, I replied simply. But you owed him your presence when he left this world, and you weren't there. She looked down, a shadow crossing her face. I know. There was no triumph in stating it, only the plain truth, like wiping dust from a forgotten windowsill. She reached into her purse, not to leave, but to retrieve something. A small, well-worn photo. It was Ethan, perhaps 5 years old, sitting on the swing in my backyard. I must have taken that picture on some long-ago Sunday, and Meredith must have clipped it from a Christmas card I'd sent years ago. He loves you, she said, her voice soft. You know that, don't you? I nodded, a lump forming in my throat. I stood outside for a moment, letting the crisp October air wash over my face. I wasn't sad. I wasn't angry anymore either. I was simply done. Done waiting for my children to become the people they never intended to be. Done mistaking duty for love. Done writing checks with my heart and expecting anything in return but silence. My footsteps echoed as I walked back to my car. The leather seat felt warmer than usual. I sat there for a moment, my hands resting on the wheel, watching people bustle by on the street. A woman passed with her daughter, holding hands, sharing a laugh. I didn't envy them. I simply noted the scene, like an old song I used to enjoy, but no longer played. That night, I slept without the TV on, without a book, without George's old sweater folded beside me, the way it had been since he'd been taken to the hospital. The silence was still there, but it didn't hurt, not anymore. The file cabinet in the hallway had 3 drawers, all meticulously labeled in George's steady block print. House, taxes, family. The last one was mine. I opened it slowly, the metal groaning a little, as if reluctant to give up its ghosts. Inside were folders upon folders, receipts, copies of checks, letters from banks, old Christmas cards tucked in between loan agreements. I had kept everything, not out of some obsessive need, but because I believed in the clarity of record. Paper doesn't lie, and that drawer held enough truth to ignite a forest fire. I sat down at the kitchen table, set the folder labeled Peter, Education and Business, to one side and opened Celia, home, and lifestyle. The handwriting was mine, neater years ago, but still legible. I started reading, a $15,000 check dated 2003. Celia's wedding. It's a small ceremony, Mom. We just want a nice venue. That nice venue had chandeliers, lobster rolls, and a string quartet. A $7,800 transfer, 2007. The roof's leaking, Mom. The baby's crib got soaked. I paid it within the hour. Ironclad protections with no loopholes, no appeals, and no chance of family members twisting his arm 5 years from now when they finally realize what they've lost. We can structure the trust to prevent exactly that, he assured me. The disbursements will be carefully controlled, contingent upon educational expenses, housing costs, or healthcare needs until he reaches the age of 30. After that, he'll have full access, but even then, we can provide protections. Would you like a co-trustee? He inquired. No, I said firmly. Ethan can hire a financial advisor if he wants one, but the decisions will be his and his alone. I trust his judgment far more than I trust most lawyers. It wasn't intended as a slight against Richard, merely a statement of fact. He adjusted his glasses, unfazed. You understand this cannot be easily undone. I don't want it undone, I stated. We went through everything with meticulous care, signatures, dates, final confirmations. It felt like building something solid and lasting. Not a house, not a business, but something far quieter and stronger, a boundary that wouldn't bend under the weight of guilt or grow weak with the passage of time. Before I left, Richard folded his hands on the desk, his expression thoughtful. May, if I may ask, and you are absolutely free to tell me it's none of my business, but are you doing this out of anger? I considered the question carefully. No, I said finally. I'm doing it out of clarity. He nodded slowly. That's a rare thing. No, I repeated, more gently this time. It's just late. Very late. When I stepped back out into the afternoon light, it felt different, cleaner, somehow lighter. Across the street was the coffee shop George and I used to frequent after running errands. I hadn't been there in years. The place had changed, with a younger staff and louder music, but I walked in anyway and ordered a cappuccino. I sat near the window, watching the street. I hope someday he loves someone like that, she added, her gaze distant. And I hope he understands how rare that kind of love is. She stood then, straightening her coat as if preparing for a journey. I won't take up any more of your time, she said, but I wanted to say all of this before the story gets twisted, before they rewrite the narrative and cast you as the villain. She walked to the door and opened it herself, a gust of wind catching the edge of her scarf. For a fleeting moment, she looked younger, less hardened, simply a woman who had spent a lifetime giving herself away to people who never even noticed. She paused in the doorway, her eyes meeting mine. Don't let them take your peace, May, she said, her voice laced with a quiet urgency. They've already taken enough. And then she was gone. I remained standing there for a long time before I finally picked up the pie and placed it in the fridge, not out of sentimentality, but simply because it would be delicious with tea tomorrow. A week later, I received a letter from the attorney. Nothing urgent, just a confirmation. The new documents had been filed. The trust was active. Ethan's name now appeared on every deed, every account, every line where Peter and Celia's names once were. The feeling was quiet, not triumphant, not dramatic, just steady, like the satisfying thud of a book finally closed after lying open too long, its pages curling at the edges. I took the envelope out into the garden. The roses had finally succumbed to the cold. George used to say, they surrendered with dignity, and I always liked that phrase. Now, I truly understood what he meant. There's a way to let go that doesn't resemble defeat. I sat on the bench and ran my fingers over the smooth paper of the envelope.
It was real now.
All of it. Not just a rash decision made in grief or anger. It had settled deep within me, permeating the house, the garden, the very air I breathed. I had done what needed to be done. $12,000 in 2011. New braces for Ethan. $5,000 in 2013. He wants to go to summer robotics camp. It's a big deal, Mom. A year later, when Celia called crying because her husband had been laid off, I sent another $20,000, no questions asked. "You always save us," she had whispered on the phone, her voice laced with desperation. "We don't know what we'd do without you." I had believed her. Peter's folder was even thicker, $25,000 seed money for a sure-thing startup that fizzled out in under 6 months. George warned me not to send it. I sent it anyway. A used car, a down payment, 3 semesters of grad school. I paid for hospital bills when his second daughter was born, and insurance when the first broke her arm. When Peter fell behind on taxes, I wrote a check and told no one. Looking at it all now, line after line, I wondered exactly when I had become their safety net. Or perhaps it had always been that way, and I was simply too willing to be wrapped around their inevitable falls. Not once, not a single time, did they ever refuse my help. But they had refused to come say goodbye to their father, and that was a debt that no amount of paper could ever repay. I put the files back into the cabinet, except for one. I kept the envelope marked Ethan. Inside was a note he had written when he was 11. Sloppy pencil lettering, folded in half. "Grandma May, thank you for teaching me to make pancakes. I think you are very wise and funny. One day I will take care of you like you take care of me." I held the paper for a long time. He was 19 now. I didn't know if he even remembered writing that letter, or if it still meant anything to him, but it certainly meant everything to me. I had meant to be fair, to divide things equally. That's what people say, isn't it? Be fair. Don't play favorites. But what if fairness wasn't sameness? What if fairness meant giving your legacy to the one person who saw you, not as a bank, but as a human being? A woman in her 30s walked by, pushing a stroller, her coat flapping open in the wind. She looked tired but determined, a familiar sight. I sipped my coffee slowly, savoring the moment. No phone in my hand, no sense of urgency, just a cup, a chair, and a full hour that belonged entirely to me. They always said this stage of life would be quiet. They didn't tell you how loud the peace could feel. Lorraine Campbell lived just 2 houses down and had done so since 1972. She and I weren't exactly the type of women who called each other best friends, but we'd shared enough cups of tea and exchanged enough knowing glances over our fences that the silence between us had evolved into its own unique kind of language. She knocked on my door around 5 p.m., carrying a tin of lemon shortbread and her usual gentle nosiness. "I saw Peter's car here yesterday," she said as soon as I opened the door. "Did he bring flowers or just excuses?" "Neither," I said, stepping aside to let her in. "He brought his wife and a suit." "Oh," she said, and that single word dripped with judgment. We settled in the living room, and I poured her tea, chamomile for her, strong black for me. She placed the tin between us on the coffee table, but didn't open it yet, preferring to wait. "I told them," I said, cutting to the chase, "everything, that they're out of the will, and that Ethan is the only one who ever came back without being asked." Lorraine let out a long, slow breath. "About damn time." I glanced at her. "I'm sorry, May," she said, softening her tone. "But I've watched you chase their approval for years, babysitting their kids when you had your own doctor's appointments, writing checks while they went on cruises, smiling politely when they forgot your birthdays. I kept thinking to myself, she'll snap one day. Thank God you finally did." "I didn't snap," I said. "I simply peeled back everything that wasn't rooted in genuine love." Lorraine smiled knowingly. Better phrased. And strangely, I felt something else stirring within me as well. Not relief, not pride, but permission. Permission to start again. Even if it was just with the small, everyday things. That afternoon, I retrieved the sewing machine. It had been packed away since before George got sick. I cleared the table, oiled the wheel, and threaded the bobbin with the same quiet care my mother had once taught me. I didn't need to create anything important, anything elaborate. I simply longed to hear the hum again, that gentle, rhythmic whir that reminded me of all the women who kept going, no matter how heavy their burdens. I made new curtains for the kitchen. They didn't match anything else in the room. Bright blue with clumsy white stitching, but they were undeniably mine. The next morning, I woke up early and made pancakes. Real pancakes from scratch, not from a box. I set 2 plates on the table, anticipation fluttering in my chest. I knew Ethan would come. He always came when he said he would. He arrived just after 9, carrying a bag of groceries I hadn't asked for. "Just thought you might want something fresh," he said, offering a sheepish grin. I smiled. "You want to learn how to make them today?" "Yeah," he said, his eyes lighting up. "I do." We cooked together. I showed him the secret to flipping them without tearing, how to test the pan's heat with a drop of water, how to gently fold the batter without deflating it. He listened intently, truly listened, not the way Peter used to, impatient, always searching for a shortcut. "You're good at this," he said, biting into the first pancake with gusto. "I've had time to practice," I replied, a hint of a smile playing on my lips. He poured more syrup and grinned. "You know, I think this place could be something." I looked at him, a question in my eyes. "The house," he clarified. "I don't just mean keeping it. I mean using it, maybe as a space for people who don't have a place to go, or even a little garden workshop. George used to say, legacy is not what you leave, it's who you leave it to." I used to think he meant financially. Now I knew he meant so much more. The house felt smaller that day, not because it had physically changed, but because I had begun to see it without the clutter of sentimentality. For years, I had kept every trinket the kids had ever given me, handmade cards, macaroni picture frames, glittery mugs. But love isn't found in objects, it's revealed in actions. And lately, their actions had all conveyed the same message. You are useful, not valuable. That afternoon, I packed up 3 cardboard boxes with the kids' old gifts, not to throw away, at least not yet. Simply to create space. Space for something else to grow. That night, I didn't drink wine. I didn't need artificial courage anymore. Instead, I made tea, real tea, the kind George had loved, loose leaves in a proper pot, steeped just right. I carried it to the living room and sat in the quiet, legs tucked under me, the soft scent of bergamot filling the air, and for the first time in a long while, I felt the faint beginnings of peace. The call came just after noon, a voice I hadn't heard in months, soft, almost hesitant. "Grandma?" It was Ethan. I closed the ledger in front of me. I'd been reviewing the utility bills, preparing to shut down some services at the lake cabin. The one Peter never used, but always referred to as a valuable asset. It wasn't an asset anymore, not to him. "Hello, darling," I said, careful to keep my voice steady. "Is everything all right?" A pause, heavy with unspoken emotion. Then, "I heard about Grandpa. I'm so sorry I didn't call sooner." I waited, not because I wanted to punish him, but because I needed to discern whether his next words were sincere. "I didn't know he passed until 2 days ago," Ethan said quickly. "Mom never told me. She said he was sick, but not that he was gone." I sat very still, absorbing the weight of his words. We sat in comfortable silence for a moment, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional gust of wind outside. Fall was beginning to settle in, the kind of fall that smelled like decaying leaves and the inevitable end of something. "Do you regret it?" she asked eventually. I shook my head. "I regret not doing it sooner." She opened the tin finally. The shortbread was perfect, crisp edges dusted with sugar, buttery and soft in the middle. We each took one and chewed thoughtfully. "You know," she said, "my niece tried to convince me to sell this house last spring. Said it was too much for me to handle, that I should move to one of those senior villas near the lake. Everything's done for you there, Auntie," she said. "Laundry, meals, even group outings." "And what did you say?" I asked, already knowing the answer. I said I'd rather die in a house full of chipped mugs and my own silence than live in a place that smelled like bleach and other people's boredom. I laughed, a small, genuine laugh that bubbled up from somewhere deep inside me. Lorraine leaned closer. "You and we come from a generation that knows exactly what endurance costs. We wore our spines down raising people who think love is measured in expensive gifts and gratitude is entirely optional." I nodded in agreement. "You're not cruel, May," she added, her voice sincere. "They'll say you are. They'll whisper about how she cut off her own children. But what they won't say is that you were also the one who kept them afloat through every single storm, even when they didn't bother to ask if you were drowning. I blinked hard, but no tears fell. We talked for another hour about her garden, the state of the neighborhood, and the squirrels that were once again chewing on her gutter. When she left, I hugged her longer than usual. That night, I didn't turn on the television. Teach people things. I felt something open inside me, something I hadn't expected.
Hope.
Not the loud, desperate kind, but the quiet, patient kind that takes root and slowly blossoms. I think your grandfather would have liked that, I said, my voice thick with emotion. He nodded, his gaze thoughtful. Maybe I'll start with the porch. Needs fixing. You'll need real tools, I said, a playful glint in my eye. Not those college boy ones in plastic kits. He laughed, a genuine, hearty sound.
Guess you'll have to teach me that too.
We ate the rest of the pancakes in comfortable silence, the air filled with the sweet aroma of maple syrup and shared purpose. After he left, I stood at the sink washing dishes, the window open, the new curtains swaying gently in the breeze. The wind carried the scent of dry leaves and something faintly sweet, maybe cinnamon, maybe memory. I looked out at the yard. The roses were gone for the season. The bench stood cold and empty. The trees were bare, but upright, their branches reaching towards the sky. And for the first time since the funeral, I felt no heavy weight pressing down on me, only the vague shape of what was to come. Something Ethan would build. Something I had cleared the space for. The first snow fell lightly, a mere whisper of white dust across the yard. The kind that doesn't stick yet, but tells you the season has truly changed. I watched it from the back porch, wrapped in my thick cardigan, a steaming mug of coffee warming my hands. Ethan was out front, measuring the steps with a small level, mumbling to himself like George used to do when he was working on a project. It had been a month since I signed the papers. The world hadn't applauded. The sky hadn't opened up in some dramatic display. But something within me had shifted. A weight I had carried for decades was finally gone. And what replaced it was not anger, not victory, just space. I had made room for something new to grow. The kids hadn't called again. He passed almost 3 weeks ago, Ethan. I know, he whispered, his voice thick with emotion.
I'm so sorry.
For a moment, neither of us spoke. I sensed something in his silence. Not guilt exactly, but genuine grief, the kind you simply cannot fake. I wanted to come see you, he added, his voice strained. If that's okay. I exhaled, releasing a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Of course it's okay. He arrived an hour later, taller than I remembered, a little unshaven, smelling faintly of clean laundry and lingering stress. He hugged me the way young people sometimes do when they are unsure if they are still welcome, one arm slightly hesitant, then embracing you fully once they realize you don't intend to pull away. I didn't pull away. We sat in the living room. I poured him lemonade, and he looked around as if the house was both familiar and foreign. That's how grief feels, I suppose. You recognize everything, but it no longer belongs to the same world. I missed his funeral, he said, his voice laced with regret. And I'll never forgive myself for that. You weren't the one who chose to miss it, I said gently, offering him some solace. He looked at me then, really looked at me, his gaze penetrating and searching. Did Mom really not come? I nodded once, my heart aching for his pain. He didn't say anything, just stared down at the coaster under his glass, running his thumb along its frayed edge. She told me they had work, he said after a while, his voice barely above a whisper. That it was handled. I should have known better. He looked up, his eyes brimming with unshed tears. Now I want to do something, he said, sitting up straighter, a newfound resolve hardening his features. For him, for you. Anything. You're doing it, I said, smiling softly. You're here. He looked unconvinced, as if simply being present wasn't enough. I hesitated, then rose and returned with a manila envelope. Instead, I pulled out an old letter George had written to me during his first business trip, tucked away in a drawer I hadn't opened in years. *May, this house is never truly empty when you're in it. You are the roof, the floorboards, and the very lock on the door. Even when it feels like no one sees you, I see you. I read it 3 times before carefully sliding it back into the envelope. The house was quiet, but it was no longer empty. Not anymore. It began with a walk, a simple, unremarkable act. But for me, it was the first walk I'd taken without a purpose tied to someone else. Not to pick up prescriptions, not to deliver a casserole, not to return a dish I hadn't asked to borrow. I simply wanted to walk. The morning was brisk, not quite cold, the kind of air that sharpened your lungs but didn't sting your skin. I wore George's old windbreaker, a size too big and frayed at the cuffs, and felt oddly comforted by its weight. I walked the neighborhood slowly, not like someone exercising, but like someone remembering what still belonged to her. The Mapletons' house still had the same faded blue shutters. The Wilsons' porch swing creaked exactly the same way it did when George used to say, "We should fix ours before that one finally falls off." He never did, and neither did they. At the park, I sat on a bench under the old elm tree, the one that had split during a storm back in '99. It still leaned slightly, stubborn and undeniably alive. Across the path, 2 young mothers pushed strollers, engrossed in a conversation about sleep training and preschools. They didn't even glance at me, and I didn't mind. I wasn't a part of their world anymore, and honestly, I didn't want to be. A woman sat down on the other end of my bench, maybe in her 40s. She had that familiar, tired but functioning look I remembered so well from my own middle years. The kind of woman who makes 5 lists a day, but routinely forgets what she walked into a room for. Celia had sent one text. Asterisk, I hope you're proud of what you've done. Asterisk, I hadn't responded. Peter's silence was longer, deeper, a void that no longer begged to be filled. I didn't chase after them. Let them tell their version of the story. Let them paint me as cold and heartless. I'd lived long enough to know that people will always rewrite the truth to make their own shame more bearable. But I knew what happened. I knew what I gave. And I knew what I reclaimed. The truth didn't need to shout. It simply needed to stand firm. Ethan knocked gently on the back door. "Grandma, you want to see the new railing?" I set down my mug and followed him out front. He'd done well. Sanded, stained, and sealed it against the weather. The porch, for the first time in years, looked like someone cared about it again. George would have said, "It leans a little to the left." I smiled, a genuine smile that reached my eyes. Ethan grinned. "So, does everyone in this family?" I laughed, a real, open laugh that hadn't lived in me for a long time. He stood beside me, wiping his hands on a rag, his eyes sparkling with pride. "I was thinking maybe next spring we could start a little garden out front. Not just flowers, vegetables, herbs, something that grows." I looked at him, and I saw not just the boy I used to tuck into bed, but the man who had chosen to show up, the man who was choosing to build a life. "That sounds just right," I said, my voice full of love and hope. We went inside, the cold starting to bite now. I made soup. He fixed the squeaky cabinet. I showed him where the breaker box was. He asked about the attic insulation. We filled the day with the small, necessary things that make a life. Not the kind you take pictures of, but the kind you miss terribly when they're gone. That night, after he left, I wrote one more letter. Not for the court, not for the lawyers, but for myself, to the woman I used to be. Asterisk, you tried longer than you should have. Inside were the trust papers, and signed, unfiled, but nonetheless very real. I hadn't brought them to the bank yet. I wanted to see Ethan's face first. I handed the folder to him. He opened it, his brows furrowing in confusion, read the first few lines, then looked at me, visibly alarmed. "Grandma, what is this?" "My plan," I said simply, my voice steady. "This is everything. The house, the cabin, even the savings accounts." "Yes, but why me?" His voice cracked with disbelief. "Why not Mom or Uncle Peter?" I could have said many things. I could have detailed their absence, their cruelty, their endless excuses and self-absorbed parties. Instead, I chose a different truth. "Because you're the only one who came back without being called," I said gently. He stared at the papers, then set them down carefully, as if afraid he might break something precious. "I don't know what to say," he murmured, his voice choked with emotion. You don't have to say anything. We sat in silence for a few minutes. Then she said, without looking at me, "Do you come here often?" "Used to," I said, "before people stopped needing rides and casseroles." She laughed softly. "That sounds nice." We didn't exchange names. We didn't need to. "I'm here to clear my head," she offered. "My daughter told me yesterday that she doesn't think she wants kids," I said. Said she's not sure she sees the point. I raised my eyebrows in sympathy. "What did you say?" I told her I didn't see the point of her 5 tattoos, but I managed to keep that to myself. I smiled wryly. "You didn't keep it to yourself, though, did you?" She laughed again, more freely this time. "No, I certainly didn't." We talked for 15 minutes about nothing of great importance and everything that truly mattered. She left first, giving a small wave. I watched her disappear around the curve of the trail, and I felt something strange and unfamiliar in my chest, a small opening, like the cracking of a long frozen door. "You bent yourself into shapes that didn't fit. Spoke gently when you should have stood tall. Gave when you should have said no. But you also loved fiercely. And that is not a mistake. Asterisk, now you are free. Free to dance in kitchens. To plant something just for the pleasure of watching it grow. To say no without guilt. To say yes without fear. To give when it is deserved, not demanded. Asterisk, you are not cruel. You are not bitter. You are clear. And that, finally, is enough." I folded the letter and placed it in the same drawer where I'd once kept the old family photos, not to hide it, but simply to know it was there, like a lighthouse I had built myself. Before bed, I stepped outside one last time. The stars were sharp and bright, the cold deeper now. I looked up at the sky and whispered, he would have been proud. Not of the decision, not even of the strength it took, but of the fact that I had finally chosen peace. Not loud, not showy, just mine. So, here's what I'll leave you with, you who have read this far, who may have your own silences, your own aching rooms, your own unspoken boundaries. Do not wait for someone to hand you peace. Choose it for yourself. Do not confuse love with obligation. Do not confuse duty with worth. And if your house is full of noise but no one hears you, create a new kind of quiet, one where you are no longer invisible, one where you do not have to disappear to feel safe. If this story resonated with something true within you, share it, tell someone, or simply hold it close, and know that it is never too late to come home to yourself. Follow for more stories like this. Leave a comment if it echoed something in you, or simply sit with it a while. I promise that's enough.